October 9th, 1950. U.S. 8th Army Women's Detention Compound, Yokohama, Japan. The first thing Haruko noticed was the heat. It rolled out of the olive drab trailer like a living thing. Oil, steam, and faintly sweet roasted meat riding on the sharp, metallic smell of gasoline fumes. The range cabinet squatted on its wheels in the mud, doors folded down into work tables, the gasoline burner inside roaring with a steady, industrial hiss. Jatancom35s.com +1. She stood at the edge of the U.S. field kitchen, hands folded around a dented aluminum pan. Her prisoner's armband itched against the coarse cotton of her dress. A corporal in faded fatigues flicked open a pocket thermometer, stabbed it into a glistening roast, and watched the tiny needle climb. Too low. Back in for 10 more minutes, he said, voice flat, the English words clipped by routine. Behind Haruko, the other women shifted, clogs scraping on the packed dirt. They were expecting ladles and filthy drums, fly-blown slop, the kind of food she had seen prisoners get in Manchuria. Instead, stainless steel ladles rested in clear hot water. Trays gleamed. A sergeant barked at a private for wiping his hands on his trousers. "Look at it," whispered Keiko, the youngest of them, in Japanese. "It's ovens on wheels." Haruko's throat tightened. The phrase sounded obscene, as if war itself had grown tidy drawers and temperature gauges. This was not how the enemy was meant to look. The mess sergeant snapped his fingers at her. "Ma'am, pan up here. Move smart." She stepped forward into the wave of heat, eyes fixed on the thermometer still ticking down. If you'd follow a full story from this moment, you can always subscribe and tell us which country you're watching from. 7 weeks earlier, Yokohama Women's Detention Compound. Rain had a way of finding every gap in the compound roofs. It slipped between warped boards and rotted shingles, dripped into buckets, and tapped steadily on the metal helmets of the sentries pacing the yard. By the time Haruko reached the administrative hut, the hem of her prison-issue dress was a dull, wet fringe around her ankles. Inside, it smelled of pencil shavings and damp wool. A single stove ticked in the corner, unlit despite the chill. At the center table, a sergeant in khaki sat with a stack of forms, his sleeves rolled neatly, his expression the bored patience of someone accustomed to long lists. "Name," he said without looking up. The interpreter beside him repeated it in careful Japanese. "Nakajima Haruko." Her own voice startled her. She had not spoken it aloud in weeks. In the barracks, they rarely used names, only bunks and numbers. The sergeant flipped through a thin manila folder, paper edges darkened by fingers. A black and white photograph was clipped to the front, her in a stiff-collared nurse uniform, cap straight, eyes narrowed by the sun on some forgotten parade ground. Someone had stamped "captured" across the bottom in purple ink. "Former rank, Lieutenant, Army Nurse Corps," the interpreter supplied, tracing kanji on a scrap to confirm. The sergeant grunted, took a red pencil from behind his ear, and drew a line under a printed category. She watched the pencil, not his face. During the war, red had meant critical patients, those closest to death. Here, it seemed to mean something else. Assignment, designation, the slow, grinding machinery of another army she did not understand. Medical training, possible work detail, the interpreter murmured in Japanese, reading upside down before catching himself. Haruko's fingers tightened around the thin cloth bag that held the last items she owned, a comb with 2 missing teeth, a folded photograph of her younger brother in uniform, and her Army nurse identification booklet, edges curled from humidity and years of being opened and closed by rough hands. The sergeant extended a palm. "Papers." She hesitated, then surrendered the booklet. He flipped through the pages, pausing at the roster of postings, the scrawled signatures of long-transferred doctors. His indifference cut deeper than suspicion would have. To him, these names, these stations, Saipan, Truk, unnamed island clinics, were just lines to be tallied. After a moment, he slid the booklet back, now with a small white tag stapled to the inside cover, bearing a new number in blocky English digits. The red pencil rested on the table, its tip still bright. "Return to barracks," the interpreter said. "You may be called for additional duty." Outside, the rain had turned to a fine mist. Haruko walked slowly, feeling the added weight of the number inside her booklet. Somewhere, in a room that smelled of paper and foreign ink, her years as a military nurse had been reduced to a note in a file. Medical training, possible work detail. She told herself it meant nothing, but in the quiet between raindrops and distant truck engines, something small and brittle shifted inside her, as if the inventory of the lost now included herself. By late afternoon, the rain had cleared, leaving the compound coated in a thin film of moisture that turned dust to paste. Laundry lines sagged between barracks, shirts and stockings hanging limp, refusing to dry. The women sat on their bunks, sleeves rolled, mending seams, or simply staring at the knotty floorboards, saving their strength for the next roll call. It began, as it always did, a whisper on the far end of the room. Someone had heard from someone who had scrubbed the corridor outside the administrative hut. New food, new rules, and inspection coming. "They say Americans must feed us like their own soldiers," one woman muttered, leaning close to Haruko. "Some law from Geneva. Is it true, Lieutenant?" The honorific slipped out, half habit, half defiance of the number stitched to Haruko's sleeve. Haruko kept her eyes on the sock in her hands. "I have not read their laws," she said. "Rumors do not fill bowls." But the question settled over the barracks like the damp. Would more rice appear, more meat, thicker soup? Hunger sharpened listening. Every boot step outside, every shouted order turned into a potential answer. At evening roll call, they formed ranks in the yard. The sea smell crept in from beyond the wire, mingled with coal smoke from the nearby depot. Floodlights clicked on, bathing the women in a flat, colorless glare. The camp commandant, a tall major with a pale, set face, stood with an interpreter and a clipboard. A notice had been nailed to the post behind him, English words in bold black, Japanese beneath in cramped brush strokes. Haruko could pick out fragments: rations, health, new arrangement, and, in her own language, an awkward phrase, cooperative work in food service. The interpreter cleared his throat. "By order of command, a small number of detainees will assist in the preparation and distribution of meals," he called. "This is to ensure proper handling, for your health, in accordance with international convention." A murmur traveled through the lines, thin as wind through reeds. "Names will be called," the interpreter went on. He took the list from the major, eyes scanning the page. First, Nakajima Haruko. For heartbeat, she did not move. The yard tilted, just slightly, as if her body considered refusing. "Orders are orders," something old insisted. But these were not orders from a colonel with a rising sun on his cap. These came from the men in khaki across the gravel. "Step forward, please," the interpreter said softly in Japanese. Her feet answered before she had finished arguing with herself. Gravel crunched under her clogs as she left the ranks, feeling dozens of eyes on her back, hot as the sun she could not see. Somewhere behind her, someone whispered her number instead of her name, as if that smaller designation could pull her back. Haruko halted beside the major, the notice about rations and health fluttering just above his shoulder. The paper smelled faintly of fresh ink. In the margin, in red pencil, someone had underlined a single word in English: compliance. The women watched. The Americans wrote. Between them, in that narrow strip of yard, Haruko stood, knowing without understanding that the red mark in her file had just become a path she could no longer pretend did not exist. They woke her before first light, when the compound still lay in a gray hush, broken only by the distant rumble of trucks on the road to the port. A guard pointed with his chin, rifle slung casually across his chest. Haruko joined a small knot of women at the gate, their breath steaming faintly in the cold. They were marched past the familiar bounds of the barracks, along a wire fence that separated their world from the logistics yard. Beyond it, the war looked different. Neat stacks of wooden crates, fuel drums lined like sentries, tents stenciled with white letters. The air smelled of damp earth and gasoline. The field kitchen sat on a patch of churned mud near a row of parked trucks. At first, she mistook the thing for another trailer, some kind of supply cabinet. Then she saw the doors folded down into metal tables, the chimney pipe, the squat firebox in the center. A soldier in the stained apron opened a hatch, and heat rolled out, warm enough that the women flinched. Range, field, gasoline, the mess sergeant announced to his men, tapping the side of the cabinet with a spoon as if introducing a trusted horse. His apron was as carefully tied as any surgeon's gown. Above his head, ladles and long-handled brushes hung from hooks, clinking softly. Haruko waited for the dirt, the flies, the carelessness she knew. Instead, she watched him run a cloth over every surface, then plunge utensils into a steaming pot of water. A private brought a pan of raw meat, pink and marbled. The sergeant produced a slim metal instrument from his pocket, unfolded it with a click, and drove its probe into the thickest part. The tiny dial trembled, then steadied. "It's cold as a nun's heart in there," he said to his men, drawing a low laugh. "Hot oven, cold center means sick troops. We do it by the numbers." Haruko did not catch all the words, but the ritual was unmistakable. Test, decide, adjust. On the islands, they had judged meat by smell alone, cutting away the gray portions when they could, serving the rest because there was nothing else. Here the enemy had ovens on wheels and numbers on dials. The sergeant turned and saw the women watching. His gaze slid over them, impersonal but not hostile, before he jerked his head toward a stack of empty pans. "Let's get you ladies scrubbed in," he said. "We keep this place cleaner than a hospital." The translator echoed the order in Japanese. Haruko's hands, already chapped from lye soap and cold water, flexed at her sides. The comparison landed like an accusation. Cleaner than a hospital. Cleaner than the wards where she had watched boys die on straw mats, without enough gauze or boiling water. She stepped forward anyway, because the guard nudged, because years of drilled obedience still lived in her muscles. As she approached the range, the heat washed over her, carrying the scent of fat beginning to render. She tried to hold on to the picture she had carried through the war. Americans as careless, dirty, contemptuous. But the thermometer was still ticking in the meat, and the man with the red, work-roughened hands was scowling not at her, but at a smear of grease on his own table. The image would not fit the story she knew. It sat there instead, bright and wrong, waiting. By midday, the kitchen yard had turned into a shallow basin of mud churned by boots. The range sat at its center like some squat metal shrine. Steam lifted from its open hatches, blurring the edges of the trucks behind it. Haruko stood at a galvanized washtub, sleeves rolled, wrists reddened by hot water and lye. "Scrub, rinse, boil," the sergeant barked, tapping each tub with the back of a ladle. In that order, no shortcuts. The interpreter repeated his words, but she hardly needed them. His meaning was in his hands, the way he inspected the ladles for grease, the quick, irritated frown if a fork came out of the rinse still cloudy. She had seen that look on surgeons' faces. To her left, Keiko scoured a tray with fierce, bone-thin arms. The girl tilted her head toward the range, where another soldier lifted a pan of potatoes into one of the square openings on the top. "Look," Keiko whispered in Japanese, "it really is an oven on wheels." The phrase was ridiculous and exact. Haruko almost told her not to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The cabinet did look like some rolling contraption from a fairground, except its purpose was not entertainment, but feeding an army with the precision of a timetable. Lines of GIs formed under a canvas fly. Trays clattered down the improvised rail of sawhorses and planks. Haruko watched as the sergeant set a deep pan into a cutout on the range top, steam curling around his forearms. He checked the knob on a valve, nodded at the steady boil, then ladled out portions in practiced arcs. One scoop of potatoes, one of stew, exactly level with the rim of the ladle each time. When her turn came, he thrust the ladle into her hand. "You here," he said. He placed her at a station with bread and thin sliced meat, gesturing. One slice, then 2 pieces of bread, tray forward. Simple, repetitive, impossible to hide mistakes. Behind the line, a guard leaned on his rifle, eyes half-lidded but not asleep. Beyond him, at the fence, 3 women from the compound stood watching, arms folded tight. Haruko felt their gazes as acutely as the heat on her face. She kept her eyes on the trays. Bread, meat, tray. The rhythm steadied her breathing. Yet every time the range doors opened, she glanced up, drawn by the glow within, the ordered fire that did as it was told, turning raw flesh into something safe according to numbers only the sergeant seemed to know. "Faster!" he snapped once, and she obeyed, hands moving with a competence she had not intended to reveal. By the time the line dwindled, her back ached and her throat was dry. The sergeant gave a curt nod. "Not bad," he said. "We'll use you again." The interpreter translated, and Keiko's elbow brushed hers, a fleeting, wordless acknowledgement. At the fence, the watchers turned away, unreadable. Haruko dipped the ladle back into the hot water tub, watching the last traces of meat juice swirl and vanish. The ovens on wheels hissed softly behind her, tire treads half sunk in mud, as if ready to move. On to the next field, the next war, leaving only the aftertaste of their precision. She told herself she hated the machine. Still, as they were marched back toward the gate, she found herself counting the range's doors and valves, memorizing them, as if knowledge were a thing she had picked up without permission and could no longer set down. The second week in the kitchen, Haruko began to see food in layers. What was served? What was left? What might be saved? What must be thrown away? The layers did not always make sense. After the noon meal, the line of soldiers thinned to nothing. The last trays slid into the return barrels with a final clatter. Steam still rose from the range, but the immediate urgency was gone. Now came the cleaning, the sergeant's true religion. "Strip the line," he ordered. Pans were lifted, scraped, carried. Haruko followed with a rag and a bucket, wiping down the crude wooden plank that served as their counter. Her eyes lingered on every crust, every smear of potatoes. At the end of the day's bread pan, 3 full slices lay untouched, pale against the tin. She glanced toward the fence. Beyond it, the barracks roofs lay in the flat afternoon light. Somewhere under them, the hollow faces of women who had not held bread this white since before the war. Her fingers twitched. 3 slices could be hidden in the folds of her dress, slipped under a mattress, divided carefully. She reached, then froze. "Stop." The sergeant's voice came from just behind her. He stepped in, took the pan from her hands, and set it down hard on the plank. One of the slices slid, landing onto the bare wood before settling crooked. He stared at it for a long second, jaw tightening. Then he picked up the entire pan, bread and all, and carried it toward a drum marked in black letters she could not fully read. The lid came off with a hollow ring, a sour smell, old stew, coffee grounds, peelings, rose as he tipped the pan and let the bread fall. "Touched a dirty surface," he said to no one in particular. "Reg says it's trash." The lid slammed back on. Haruko felt heat rise in her chest, hotter than the range had ever been. Trash. The word lodged like a bone. In the wards, they had brushed maggots from rice and eaten it anyway. Here, the enemy discarded slices that still seemed to glow with softness. That night, in the barracks, she watched Keiko's hands shake as the girl raised her thin bowl of watery soup. Haruko said nothing of the bread. Instead, she lay awake, replaying the arc of the pan tipping into the drum, the sound of good food hitting rot. The next day, as she took her place at the line, she began silently counting not just the portions given, but the ones that never reached any mouth at all. Somewhere between the range and the drum lay a space she could not yet cross, a shadow cast by rules she was beginning to understand but could not accept. The day they cooked the roast, a thin frost clung to the barrels at the edge of the yard. Breath hung in the air like smoke. Even the range took longer to warm, its first exhalations of heat slow and grudging. Haruko worked the wash line, sleeves damp, hands burning from hot water. She smelled the meat before she saw it, rich, heavy, a scent that seemed impossible in a place where their own soup barely clouded the surface of the bowls. The sergeant hauled the pan from the oven compartment with a grunt. Browned fat crackled along the edges. "Looks good, Sarge," a private said. "Looks ain't the standard," he replied. Haruko watched him set the pan on the metal table. Steam rose in white sheets. He pulled the folding thermometer from his pocket, flipped it open with a practiced snap, and drove the probe deep into the center of the roast. The tiny dial climbed, hesitated, then settled. His mouth tightened. 130, he said. "Been sitting out too long. Below 140, it's trash." Trash. Again that word. He turned, already reaching for the drum lid. Something in Haruko broke loose. "Still good," she said. The English came out rough, but clear enough that every head nearby turned. The sergeant stopped. For a second, the kitchen noise thinned. The clank of pans, the hiss of the burner, all pushed to the edge of her hearing. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if remembering she was more than an extra pair of hands. "You think so?" he asked, slow. Her heart hammered. She thought of jungle outposts where they had carved the rot from meat and boiled the rest twice, of boys who had eaten whatever she gave them because there was nothing else. "Yes," she said, softer. "Hungry. Still good." He sighed through his nose, then lifted the thermometer so she could see the dial. "This number here," he said, tapping the glass. "Too low, bugs grow. Men get sick, maybe die. I don't feed my troops roulette." She understood less than half the words, but his finger on the dial, the emphasis on sick, landed. In her mind, it overlapped with fever charts, with the stink of latrines dug too shallow. He opened the drum. The sour smell of old scraps billowed out. With a single, decisive motion, he tipped the pan. The roast slid, hit the rim, then dropped out of sight with a wet, heavy sound. Behind the fence, a woman made a strangled noise. Haruko did not turn. Her cheeks burned, not from the range, but from the eyes she could feel on her back. Guards, prisoners, all measuring what her brief protest had meant. The sergeant closed the drum and snapped the thermometer shut. "Next time, we move faster," he said. "No waste if we don't let it sit." As he walked away, Haruko stared at the spot where the roast had been. Her stomach ached. So did something deeper, something caught between two truths. That meat could keep someone alive, and that it could also carry death, invisible as breath. She had spoken up for hunger and been answered in the language of numbers. The sound of the roast hitting the bottom of the drum followed her all afternoon, as loud as any shell burst she had ever heard. That night, the barracks seemed smaller. The air sat heavy, thick with damp wool and the sour trace of cabbage from the evening soup. The single bulb overhead threw a cone of yellow that failed to reach the corners. Shadows pooled beneath the bunks like standing water. Haruko sat on her mattress, folding and refolding the same rag. Across the room, Keiko's whisper started and stopped twice, like someone trying to light a damp match. "You spoke," the girl said at last, voice carrying farther than she seemed to intend. To him, about the meat. Conversation around them thinned. Needles paused above torn seams. A spoon stopped midair. Haruko kept her eyes on the rag. "I said it was still good," she answered. "He disagreed." "He threw it away because you argued wrong," another woman snapped from the opposite bunk. "If you had taken it, if you had hidden just a little, and been searched at the gate," someone else cut in. "Then what? Bread today? Beatings tomorrow?" The words bounced in the cramped space, gathering weight. Haruko felt them settle on her shoulders. She had imagined anger from the guards, not from her own. "Since when do you care for their rules?" the first woman demanded. "You sound like them. Too low, too dangerous, as if sickness is worse than hunger." Haruko's jaw tightened. Pictures rose unbidden. A tent that smelled of feces and carbolic acid, boys curling around their stomachs, water in their cups, cloudy and warm. No thermometers there. Only guesswork and prayers to spirits she had long stopped naming. "There are sicknesses worse than hunger?" she said quietly. Silence stretched. Then the oldest woman in the barracks, Nakamura-san, the one they all called Aunt, despite her sharp tongue, shifted her weight and sat upright, joints cracking. "Come here," she told Haruko. Obedience came before thought. Haruko crossed the narrow aisle and knelt beside her bunk. The older woman's face was a map of fine lines, eyes clouded but steady. "Explain the little clock," Nakamura-san said. "The needle. Why did the foreign sergeant trust it more than his own eyes?" Haruko hesitated. The English words were thin in her mouth, but the idea beneath them felt solid. "It tells how hot inside," she said, shaping the air with her hands, as if holding an invisible roast. "Outside can lie, inside cannot. If it is not hot enough, invisible things live. They make the stomach, water, the blood, dirty." As she spoke, she heard the cadence of old lectures from Japanese doctors, the smell of chalk and disinfectant. Yet the image in her mind was the American's stubby finger on the glass, the way he had said sick, with the same frown she had seen on her own officers. Nakamura-san listened, brow furrowing. "In the jungle," Haruko went on, "we had no such clocks. We guessed. Many died anyway." A murmur moved through the bunks. Different now. Less accusation. More something like reluctant recognition. "So you say the waste was right?" the first woman asked, the word bitter. Haruko looked at her, then at the low ceiling stained by old leaks. "I say," she replied slowly, "that I have watched men die from what they ate. Today, I watched food die instead. I do not know yet which is worse." The bulb flickered once, then steadied. The women laid down, one by one, though sleep did not come easily. Haruko returned to her bunk, the image of the dial still bright behind her eyes. In the quiet, the court of women adjourned without verdict. But the question Nakamura-san had asked, about trusting a needle over one's own eyes, remained, lodged like a sliver under the skin, impossible to ignore. They learned of the inspection the way they learned of everything, from a guard's offhand remark that echoed down the grapevine until it reached the barracks. "Men from the Red Cross," someone said. Others insisted it was only more American officers checking boxes on forms. The morning they came, the sky was a hard, pale blue, the kind that made every shadow sharp. Haruko was already in the kitchen yard, hands chapped and wet, when the jeep rolled in. 2 officers climbed out, caps square, overcoats buttoned. Between them walked a thinner man in a dark suit, a red cross stitched neatly onto an armband over his sleeve. He carried a clipboard instead of a sidearm. The mess sergeant wiped his hands on a towel and straightened his apron. The range had never looked cleaner. Pans gleamed, the garbage drum lid was sealed tight. Haruko could smell fresh soap under the usual scents of fat and coffee. The visitors walked the line. An American lieutenant pointed at the range, speaking in English too fast for her to follow. The Red Cross man peered into the open oven, nodded, scribbled notes. His gaze slid to Haruko, lingering on the white armband at her own sleeve. "Prisoner labor," the lieutenant said, slower now, glancing toward the interpreter at their side. "Helps proper handling, yes?" The interpreter relayed the question. Haruko kept her eyes lowered, hoping to pass as just another pair of hands. The Red Cross man stepped closer. "Ask her," he said, voice mild but precise. "Is the food sufficient? Is it clean?" The words reached her in Japanese. Enough. Clean. The women at the fence had drifted nearer, pretending to busy themselves with laundry, ears straining. Haruko felt their attention like a wire across her back. She thought of the wasted roast, the discarded bread, of Keiko's still visible ribs. She also thought of the steaming tub where ladles stood, the thermometer's careful arc, the way her own stomach had stopped twisting after meals. "It is cleaner than before," she said slowly, choosing each word. "We are less sick." The interpreter translated. The Red Cross man nodded, wrote something down. "But we are still hungry," Haruko added, before she could stop herself. Another flurry of translation. The man's lips pursed, then eased. He wrote again. The inspection moved on, to the water barrels, the latrines, the barracks. The lieutenant paused once more to gesture at Haruko, saying something about compliance and examples. A camera appeared briefly, its shutter clicking as she ladled stew into an empty tray held by a guard for demonstration. By afternoon, the jeep was gone. The yard returned to its usual rhythm of clatter and steam. Yet the impression lingered. For a few minutes, she had been less a prisoner than a piece of evidence, held up to prove something about standards and care. That night, in the barracks, no one spoke of collaboration. Instead, Nakamura-san only asked, "Did they hear hungry?" Haruko lay awake long after the others slept, replaying the moment when 2 truths had pulled at her tongue in different directions. Somewhere in an office, her words now lived as lines of ink on foreign paper. Somewhere in the kitchen, the sergeant scrubbed his range even harder. The girl went down so quietly that at first no one noticed. Evening soup had just been ladled, thin broth with a few floating grains of rice, when her metal bowl slipped from her fingers, clanged off the edge of the bunk, and spun across the floor. "Keiko," someone hissed. Haruko turned. The younger woman sat slumped against the post, eyes half closed, breath shallow. Her skin had the gray-yellow cast Haruko knew too well. Around them, the barracks erupted into motion. Women crowding close, bowls knocked over, liquid soaking into straw. "Back," Haruko snapped, the old authority rising to her throat before she could hide it. "Give her air." The command cut through the noise. They parted just enough for her to kneel. Keiko's pulse fluttered under her fingers, too fast and weak. Haruko pressed the back of her hand to the girl's forehead. Heat radiated, dry and baking. The guard at the door shouted, and moments later another appeared with his rifle and a flashlight. The beam swept the room, caught the overturned bowl, the girl's limp head. Food, he said, gesturing. Poison? The word rippled like a chill. Faces turned toward Haruko and, beyond her, toward the direction of the kitchen. Toward the range, the ladles, the numbers on the dial. Bring her to infirmary, the first guard ordered, gesturing with the muzzle. They carried Keiko between them, Haruko walking alongside, her hand on the girl's wrist as if her touch alone might anchor the racing pulse. The infirmary was a bare room off, the main yard, smelling of carbolic and damp blankets. A single metal bed waited, sheets washed thin. A young U.S. medic met them, hair too long at his collar, sleeves rolled. He fumbled for words, then offered a mercury thermometer with an apologetic half-smile. Haruko took it, slid it under Keiko's tongue, held it in place with practiced fingers. She checked eyes, pressing a lid gently back. Dry. Pinched the skin on the back of the hand. It stayed tented. No cramping, no sudden vomiting. This was not the violent, immediate storm of bad meat. This was a long siege, weeks of too little, a lurking infection finally pushing her over. Not from food today, Haruko said firmly, in Japanese first, then in halting English to the medic. Long, hungry, sick before. The medic studied Keiko, then nodded slowly. Dehydration, he murmured. He reached for a chipped enamel cup and a bottle of salts, began to mix. Back in the barracks, rumors would already be forming, blame reaching for whatever shape it could grasp. Here, at the narrow edge of the bed, Haruko felt again the old weight. To name the cause, to direct fear toward truth, not convenience. She held the cup to Keiko's lips as the girl stirred, whispering her name. Whether they believed her or not, this diagnosis would follow her into whatever came next, toward the range, the rules, and the fragile space between hunger and harm. The morning after Keiko's collapse, the air cut colder than before. Frost silvered the truck beds and made the mud around the range crust underfoot. The field kitchen exhaled heat in steady waves, its chimney breathing a thin column of steam into the pale sky. Haruko stood with an empty pan in her hands, at the edge of the warmth. The sergeant opened the oven compartment. The blast of air hit her face. Meat, metal, hot fat. He slid out a roast and set it down. Again the pocket thermometer appeared. Again the probe bit into the flesh. She watched the dial climb. The moment folded over another in her memory. Steam, meat, the needle hesitating. Too low. Back in for 10 more minutes, he said, exactly as before. Behind her, the women shuffled, clogs scraping. Keiko, pale but upright, leaned against the fence, eyes fixed on the range. It's ovens on wheels, she murmured again, this time with something like respect. Haruko's fingers tightened on the pan. She thought of the infirmary, of the medic's nod when she had named the sickness, of Nakamura-san's question about trusting the little clock more than eyes, of the inspector's pen scratching when she said, less sick, still hungry. The sergeant turned to set up the line, one opening on the range for stew, one for potatoes, the rest of the pans to be set on bare boards, cooling even as the day wore on. Wait, Haruko heard herself say. He glanced back, brows rising. The guard at the gate shifted his grip on the rifle. The women stilled. She stepped closer, feeling the heat bite through the thin soles of her clogs. With the pan, she mimed pouring water into the empty openings, then seating the food pans into them. She tapped the side, water, then held her hand above, palm flat, as if feeling steady warmth instead of the quick fade of cooling metal. Hot, around, she said, searching for words. Like bath, food stay, safe, long time. The sergeant stared at her, then at the range top. Understanding flickered. You mean use it like a steam table, he muttered to himself. He took the pan from her, sloshed a measure of water into the square opening, then lowered a stew pan into it. Steam puffed up around his wrists, He shot a look at the lieutenant observing from the side. "Reg doesn't say we can't," he called. "Just says keep it above 140. This'll help." The officer shrugged, half amused. "If it keeps the inspectors off my back, do it." The sergeant grunted, then nodded at Haruko. "All right, we'll try it your way." He handed her the thermometer. For a moment it lay cold and unfamiliar in her palm. She set the tip into the stew, watched the needle hover above the line he'd pointed to so many times. "Good," she said softly, in English this time. At the fence, Keiko whispered the phrase again. Ovens on wheels. But now it sounded different. Less like a curse, more like a tool. Haruko stepped back into the flow of work, feeling the eyes on her from both sides of the wire. Each ladle of stew she would serve today would have passed through this new arrangement, suspended between fire and water, between two systems of care that had once seemed incapable of touching. She did not know yet what story she would tell herself about this moment. Only that she had crossed a line as invisible and real as any painted on the ground. Change, when it came, did not announce itself. It crept in on steam. For days after Haruko's suggestion, the kitchen yard followed the new pattern. Water first, poured into the square mouths on the range top until it lapped against the sides. Then the deep pans lowered, stew, rice, vegetables, nested like cargo in a ship's hold. Lids rattled softly as the water below simmered. The mess sergeant checked the thermometer more than ever, as if determined to prove the experiment right or wrong. Each time he read the dial and grunted, "Good," some tight muscle in Haruko's shoulders loosened a fraction. The serving line changed too. The lieutenant, satisfied with the inspection report, had issued an order. Prisoners' evening meal would be drawn from the same steam-held pans once the soldiers were done, not from a separate batch, rushed and cooling. It meant a longer, stricter line at the fence, bowls held out exactly so, a guard counting under his breath. Some women bristled. "We stand like they do now," one muttered. "Soon we'll be saluting their spoons." Haruko said nothing. She watched faces instead, the winces that used to follow the first swallow, the hands that had gone instinctively to their bellies after every meal. She waited for those reflexes, the flinches she knew as well as any symptom. One evening, as they shuffled back from the kitchen with their bowls, Nakamura-san fell into step beside her. The old woman's gait was still stiff, but less uncertain. "Yesterday," she said quietly, "no pain. Today, also, less." Her eyes stayed forward. "Maybe the hot bath for soup makes old stomach behave." She did not say thanks. She did not say American. The acknowledgement sat there between them, small and heavy. Haruko let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The steam from her own bowl fogged her glasses for a moment, blurring the yard, the fence, the silhouette of the range behind them. When it cleared, everything looked the same, and not. In the days that followed, small changes accumulated like crumbs no one swept away. A GI in line started leaving his tray a heartbeat longer in front of Haruko, allowing her to level the ladle without haste. A guard nodded once, almost imperceptibly, when he saw her tap the thermometer and adjust a lid. Stories shifted too. The women still cursed the hunger, still cataloged every slight. But when someone mentioned ovens on wheels, the words no longer came out edged only with bitterness. There was a grudging practical respect in the way they watched the steam rise. At night, lying on her bunk, Haruko listened to the familiar chorus of coughs and turning bodies, fewer moans, fewer urgent footsteps toward the latrine. The line between their world and the Americans remained, wire and language and memory. Yet in that narrow space above the range, where fire, water, and metal met, something else had formed, a thin band of shared procedure, humming at the edge of understanding. She did not know what name to give it, so she said nothing and waited to see what would last. The notice went up on the bulletin board outside the administrative hut, a list of numbers and names in 2 scripts, announcing review for transfer or continued detention. The women clustered around it in knots, breaths white in the morning air. Haruko read her own name without surprise. After years of waiting, another layer of uncertainty did not move her much. That afternoon, the kitchen felt oddly calm. No inspection, no new orders. The routine unfolded, as it always did now. Water into the range openings, pans nested, lids clinking softly. The thermometer rose and fell, obedient. When the last tray had been washed and the garbage drum sealed, the sergeant lingered by the range instead of heading straight for the depot. He wiped his hands on his apron, then reached into the breast pocket of his shirt. "Hey," he said, "Nakajima." Her name came out bent but recognizable. She turned. He held out a small rectangle of card, corners bent, a grease stain darkening one edge. Across its face, neat typed lines listed ingredients and quantities. In the margins, someone, probably him, had scribbled numbers in pencil. 140D hold, 165 the green min, arrows pointing to the words roast, stew. "For when you cook." "Later," he said, searching for the rest of the sentence. "Good. To remember." His hand hovered a second longer, as if unsure whether to withdraw. Haruko hesitated. Then she took the card. The paper was thicker than her nurse booklet's thin pages, rough where grease had seeped in. The English words meant little on their own. The numbers did. They were the same she had watched on the dial, the ones that now existed in her mind alongside old lessons about pulse and fever. Back in the barracks, she sat on her bunk and opened the worn identification booklet. Her own photograph stared up at her from years ago, cap straight, gaze harder. Below it, postings and signatures from a vanished army. She slid the recipe card between 2 pages and closed the cover. The booklet bulged slightly now, as if it held more years than before. Around her, the women talked in low voices about transfers, about home villages that might no longer exist as they remembered them. Keiko leaned against the post, dozing. Outside, somewhere beyond the wire, a truck started, gears grinding. Haruko rested her hand on the booklet in her lap. The dead were still with her. The war had not become smaller. But within the thin pasteboard covers, Japanese ink and American pencil lay together, pressed close. Whatever kitchen she might one day stand in, village hearth, city restaurant, some other institution's back room, she knew those combined markings would guide her hands, not toward forgetting, but toward keeping those who ate a little safer than before. It was not absolution. It was not peace. It was, for the first time in years, a way to imagine a future that did not begin and end with the moment the guns fell silent. And for now, in a compound that smelled of coal smoke and cooling metal, that was enough.